Imagine waking up to the sound of artillery. Buildings are shaking. The sky is filled with smoke. German troops are advancing from every direction. And inside a fortress surrounded by enemy forces, Soviet soldiers realize something terrifying. They are almost completely cut off. There is little communication with the outside world. Ammunition is limited. Water is becoming scarce. Reinforcements are not coming. Yet the defenders refuse to surrender. This is the story of the Battle of Brest Fortress, one of the most dramatic episodes of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, sending millions of troops across the Soviet border. The attack came with enormous speed. German aircraft struck Soviet airfields. Armored formations pushed deep into Soviet territory. Communications collapsed in many areas, and thousands of Soviet soldiers were caught completely off guard. Near the border stood Brest Fortress. It was not designed to withstand a modern war of this scale. But when the German attack began, Soviet troops inside the fortress immediately found themselves in the middle of a battlefield. Artillery smashed into the walls. Buildings collapsed. Smoke filled the courtyards. German infantry began moving toward the fortress, expecting the defenders to collapse quickly. Instead, they encountered resistance. Soviet soldiers organized themselves into small defensive groups. Some fought from damaged buildings. Others occupied underground passages and fortified positions. The fortress was divided into isolated pockets, making communication extremely difficult. But that isolation also created a strange advantage. The Germans could capture one section without necessarily eliminating the resistance in another. Every room, corridor, courtyard, and ruined building could become a defensive position. The first German attacks encountered heavy resistance. And then something became clear. The fortress was not going to fall as quickly as expected. German troops had to fight for every section. The defenders were surrounded, but they continued firing. They launched local counterattacks whenever they saw an opportunity. Some Soviet soldiers attempted to break through the German lines. Others stayed behind to defend wounded comrades and hold their positions. The situation inside the fortress became increasingly desperate. Food was running out. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Water became one of the most valuable resources. German forces controlled the approaches to the Bug River, making access to water extremely dangerous. Soldiers had to risk enemy fire simply to survive. And yet the fighting continued. The psychological pressure was enormous. The defenders knew that the main Soviet armies were falling back. They knew that German forces were advancing deeper into Soviet territory. And they had no guarantee that anyone was coming to rescue them. Still, they kept resisting. This is what made Brest Fortress so significant. It was not simply a battle of weapons. It became a battle of endurance. The Germans possessed tanks, artillery, aircraft, and overwhelming operational strength. The Soviet defenders had ruined fortifications, limited ammunition, and almost no reliable communication with the outside world. But they had one thing the German command had underestimated: the determination to keep fighting. Days passed. Then more days. The fortress became a maze of destruction. Walls were shattered. Buildings burned. The defenders became exhausted and wounded. But German troops continued to encounter resistance from isolated Soviet groups. Some defenders were eventually captured. Others were killed. And some continued fighting even after the fortress had effectively been surrounded and its organized defense had collapsed. The resistance became so persistent that German forces had to use heavy artillery and increasingly powerful attacks to eliminate the remaining positions. Eventually, the fortress was overwhelmed. But its story did not end with the final collapse. The battle became a symbol of Soviet resistance during the opening stage of World War II. The defenders of Brest had not stopped the German invasion. They could not. The German offensive continued deep into Soviet territory. But their resistance demonstrated something important. The Soviet Union was not going to collapse as quickly as German planners had expected. Across the Eastern Front, the Red Army would suffer catastrophic losses during the first months of the war. Cities would fall. Entire armies would be surrounded. Millions would be killed or captured. Yet the Soviet military would continue rebuilding and fighting. Eventually, the German advance would slow. Then stop. And finally, it would begin moving backward. Brest Fortress became part of that enormous story. A story about soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, fighting with limited resources while the world around them was collapsing. They were surrounded. They were isolated. They were running out of everything. But they kept resisting. And sometimes, in war, the most powerful message is not how many enemies you defeat. It is how long you refuse to surrender. The defenders of Brest Fortress became remembered for exactly that. They stood against overwhelming force when the odds were almost impossible. And their resistance became one of the earliest symbols of the brutal determination that would eventually help carry the Soviet Union from the disaster of 1941 to victory in 1945. This was Brest Fortress. A battle that was supposed to end quickly. But instead, it became a story of survival, sacrifice, and defiance that would be remembered for generations.